Hey folks, how's it going? Today I'm reviewing Writing for Games, Theory and Practice by Hannah Nicklin. I received this book as a free review copy, and I'm going to talk about it. We're going to talk about games, we're going to talk about writing in games. But if you're in a rush, what's the short version review? The short version review, if you've got this open on Amazon right now, and you're considering whether or not this is the right fit for you, I would say that this book is the right fit if you are a student and you really don't know anything about the video game process. Maybe you've played games, maybe you're a fan of games, you know a little bit about story writing, but not a lot, and you want to sort of get a nice hand to walk you into the shallow end of the pool so that you can kind of start swimming. This book, I think, is not going to be useful for somebody who is already an experienced writer, even if they're outside of games. I feel like it spends a lot of time on just basic writing stuff that you're just going to get bored. You're going to be flipping through the pages. It's not going to be a good experience. And then somebody who's already an established video game writer in games, there's really not a high enough density of gems, of takeaways in this book to justify, I think, the time it takes to read it. So there's other books out there which I would recommend to you. My favorite book on video game writing is this one right here. It's called The Ultimate Guide to Video Game Writing and Design by Flint Dille and John Zerplatten. That book remains my number one book when it comes to video game writing. I think that book has a lot more of the practice in there rather than the theory. And so I've taught game development before, and I'm still gonna, if I teach it again, I'm still gonna be pushing my students in that direction. I think that's a really good resource, even if you're not a writer, which I think is probably an important thing to talk about now, which is, hey, why am I reading a book about video game writing? I'm not really a video game writer. I'm an engineer. Is there any value to learning about the process if you're on the other side of the creative room, let's say? I would say, yes, there is. I may not be a writer myself. Well, the only video game writing credits I have are on my indie games. My most popular indie game, No Stranger, has over a million downloads on the phone, right? And maybe like 2 million if you count the iPhone. And so that is probably the extent of how far my writing has reached. And of course, that's thanks a lot to my creative writing partner, Scott. But besides that, I haven't done any writing on AAA games, but I think it's still really important to know. And the reason why is because as a gameplay engineer, first of all, you're going to be asked to give feedback for the whole unit, right? When you play through a vertical slice of your game, you're going to want to be given feedback to the narrative, the gameplay, and how it all ties together. So I think it's really valuable for every member of the team to have an appreciation for the other skills. And then, I think that's the most important reason. I think also just in the practice of appreciating art, it really helps to understand the skills that go into it, just in general. And I might do some writing for some indie games coming up, so that's another reason why I'm always excited to learn more about the craft. And so now let's get into the more detailed review. I gave you sort of the short version. If we were to just talk about what is this book and what does it bring to the table, it's got a few different parts which are split up. They split up the book. The first part is called Theory. Then the second part is case studies, and then the last is a practical workbook of sort of like exercises that you could do on your own in order to train your skills. And I would say I really dislike the format of this book. I think that that the other guide, I'll call that the Thug Guide, just because the first initials are like THUG. The Thug Guide does, I think, a much better job of putting the practices into the chapters themselves, right? So sort of all of the different practices are tucked away at the end of this book. I don't think that's effective. I think what should have been done is you take short 30-minute practices, like little what the hell's the name of this? Like little exercises. Take little 30-minute exercises and spread them out throughout the book in the sections where it's relevant, right? Like you just teach me something about branching dialogue. Well, then give me a little, 30-second or 30-minute, I keep forgetting the word, practice section. What is it called? Exercises. Give me exercises. Okay. That's the word. Give me a little 30-minute exercise right after you teach me that so I can concretely, gain those skills and practice them. I think shoving them all to the back was a poor decision in editing. The next thing is the case studies. So we're kind of working backwards here. The case studies were really brief, right? Out of this 300-page book, the case studies account for maybe 30 pages. So it's like a tenth of the book. So it's not a lot. But there's other case studies peppered in here. I should say that the author, so the author doesn't have a lot of experience, frankly. They've created one game. At least that's the only one they mentioned. They've done, I think, some consultancy work on some other stuff, and they also have a graduate degree in writing. But when it comes to I don't know anything about this author. So to the extent that I have looked up, I haven't looked up anything, right? So to the extent what they've told me, they only seem to mention one game here. It's some indie game, I think, called Mutazion or something like that. And it's I haven't played it before, but I think, yeah, Mutazion. And if you are reading this book, I think it might be prudent for you to play that game, just because that's the only game they really mention, or it's the game they mention the most, I should say. And so that might be useful to better understand what the heck they're talking about, because they do a number of case studies from there in different parts of the book, and I thought that was really good. But I just don't think this person has enough experience to sort of leverage all these lessons on their own. And so that's probably the greatest strength of this book, I should say, is they link off to other resources. So this author, I would say, is the kind of person who probably wouldn't be afraid to say, oh, I haven't done that before. Let me link you to somebody who has. So, they do a good job of linking to blog posts and other resources online. But I think their experience is also a little bit limited in that there's a number of things that I think they definitely should have linked to that seemed like I was like distraught that they didn't mention them. So, for example, there's an example here. Let me see if I could find it. So there's one of these guys. I don't know if you've seen this before in a video game, but this is like, it's saying like, oh, okay, this is the line that the character says, and what causes them to say that line, and who says it, and what do they say, and then you can control when it comes up and stuff like that. Whenever I see one of these tables, I absolutely think they should have linked Elon Ruskin's GDC talk on fuzzy pattern matching in Left 4 Dead AI. That's a huge talk. I think it's very important to this industry. And so it was weird that wasn't here. Like, it felt missing. And there's a number of other times where I was like, okay. I definitely would have wanted my students to kind of check some of those other things out, because I feel like it's not I feel like at times it's not a complete picture. And well, for what they do focus on, there's definitely, like, I scratched my head a few times with respect to like what they chose to include. Here's this is Freytag's pyramid. I learned this in like middle school, but they call that the where I grew up, they call that the witch's hat. The Freytag's pyramid, they called it the witch's hat in like my writing class. And like that was really elementary stuff I was taught in school. And so maybe, and like I didn't go to any special writing school or anything like that, so maybe I'm just taking for granted the education I got. But like I don't know, it just seemed out of place in like in this kind of work. It seemed like I would have expected my author to assume I came in with some working knowledge and things like that. So yeah, there's just a lot of stuff here where they're like, I think at some point she defines what is a cliffhanger, and it's like, a cliffhanger, I already know what a cliffhanger is. So did they take a spin on it? Did they explain it in a unique way that I didn't understand, or give me some context within the medium of games? Not really. So I felt like there was a number of areas like that just kind of had me scratching my head of like, like, why was this included? This didn't seem like too essential. Marshall McLuhan is referenced in this book a few times, but I thought it was actually interesting that they didn't mention his most infamous quote, I think, the most important one for our medium, which is when he says, the medium is the message. There's other books I've read, maybe this is from the Thug book or some other book, where, they talk about, there's sort of a hierarchy when a player experiences games, right? They can read that it happened, or they can see it happen, right? So reading is sort of like lore. When somebody picks up in a game, they might read flavor text in like a Skyrim book or something like that. That's one way to do it, right? But it's a hierarchy. The next way is they might see it happen, where maybe they see it in a cutscene, but they feel like they haven't actually done it, right? And then the next part is the actual ludology of the matter, which is where they do it, right? So it's a process of like reading it and then seeing it and then doing it, right? And I feel like that relationship is the most important thing for a narrative designer to understand in video games. And I don't really feel like they crack the surface of that conundrum in this book, because it's really tough, but to understand that and to master that, because of course we want the player to be able to do as much as possible, and yet we can't, right? Because there's a lot of limitations to what we can pay for and expense, not only in just production cost, but also in our engineering capabilities and also in the players. You can't do everything in one game, right? And you can't have the gameplay encompass the whole narrative. So I think it's a tough balancing act between all those different things. And I feel like that's kind of like the most essential question for a narrative designer. And I don't really feel like we scratched the surface here. That quote, by the way, from Marshall McLuhan is when he says, "The medium is the message." The medium is the message. I think that's so important to talk to students about. And even just somebody who's coming into games as an established writer in another field, maybe they've written novels or something and now they want to write interactive media. That's the most important thing for them to understand, is sort of where that player agency comes into the picture of a story. Because, I mean, a writer of any medium, whether it's news or radio, or this person talked a little bit about how they have experience in radio, operas or soap operas and stuff like that. Any of those people, any of those writers can write a story, right? Because they're a writer. That's the most essential. That's like the common denominator of any good writer, is that they could write a good story. But telling a good story is, I think, you can only tell a good story relative to your skills in telling a story of that medium. If you take the best person who's good at telling a campfire story, they might not be the best person when it comes to telling a story through a comic book. They might not necessarily be the best person, because that takes a different set of skills, and it leans on a different set of paradigms, and it's just sort of a different animal. So I feel like there's a lot of work that needs to go into teaching people how to tame the animal that is game development, and how to tame the animal that is player agency, especially when we get into some 3D worlds and stuff like that, where the player can walk away from a character while they're talking, or talk to characters out of order. How do you write a story where they might read the middle before they read the beginning? They talk about that a little bit, but basically her answer was just, none of the parts are... I wasn't satisfied with that. So I think there's a lot more work that could be done there, and I think there's other books that do it better, namely Thug, and I'm actually not too familiar with the literature here. And I think that's where this book really shines, because they do a really good job of linking to other literature. This person is very much an academic. You could tell that, right? And they talk about some degrees that they have. But I think that I think it's a little bit too divorced from the practice of actually making the game. And maybe, they'll write another book after they've released another 10 titles, and they'll have a whole different take on how to do it, right? But I feel like that's kind of some places where the book was really good, and some places where the book kind of fell short of what I was looking for as somebody who's been in this industry for a little bit, and is maybe not new to terms like cliffhanger and some of the stuff that I would kind of take for granted as like basic. In the writer's room, I feel like I could say cliffhanger and everybody would know what I'm talking about, but maybe that's not the case for everyone. There's some really good shit in here. There is definitely gems in this book, but I feel like they're a little bit too hard to suss out. So I just wanted to identify a passage that stuck with me when I was reading it, and I thought was quite profound. I thought it was something that I would have been glad to have paid for, this kind of insight. This is paragraph 5 of page 75. Let me read it to you. But isn't it special and good to be able to play as someone else, to empathize with them? People are not holidays you can take, and truly understanding a person and their experience as your own is fundamentally impossible. Empathy, in fact, is the act of trying to cross that gulf, a profound act because it is impossible. Empathy is an act of beautiful failure. That is why I believe difficult decisions with difficult outcomes are much more human and compelling than the obvious answer the game wants you to pick. Empathy is not an affordance, innate quality, of games. It is a very difficult effect you need to design for. So those are some comments on empathy in game writing. And that's a paragraph I could probably read another 2 times and gain a new insight from. It's really well written. But these gems are just very few and far between when it comes to this book. I should also mention, on this note, that this writer is very invested in identity politics. You could tell that this is a very important thing for this author. Speaking towards getting a diverse set of writers in the writers' room and things like that. So just be mindful of that in case that's something that resonates with you as a particular important part of the craft. It definitely stood out because there's a lot of areas where there's quite a few times in this book where they'll say something like, "There's too many cis white het as in heterosexual writers or characters in our video games, and we got to change that, right?" So there's a lot of that in this book. Social justice, I love social justice on this channel. It's a big part of what I do. So I definitely, I love to see it, but I know it's not for everyone. Anything else I wanted to say in this book? Any other notes? It's certainly well edited. I didn't find a lot of grammatical errors or writing mistakes. I found one issue on the 3rd sentence of page 244. But besides that, nothing stood out to me. And I it's kind of silly, right? To mention that, but the reason I do is because the book I normally send my students to, Thug, that book, yikes, it's a train wreck. There's so many errors and spelling errors and grammar issues, and I guess not every writer is an editor. So that is what it is. But I think this book is actually very well put together, and it's quite coherent. Even if I don't agree with the act structure, it was a creative choice that was made, and I think she does a really good job of carrying that through. Anything else I want to mention here? It's a book that's really written from experience. There's a lot of, they lean on their personal experience a lot in this book, and I just think that I'm really excited to see what this writer's going to do. Maybe if they get a few more credits under their belt, I feel like there's not a. I feel like that would help a lot. So the value I received from this book is a lot like the book Significant Zero, if you've ever read that book. Significant Zero is a book about somebody who's in the games industry, and they talk a little bit more about their experiences of being part of the Magic than the practical skills, and it's not, this book is not so much a how-to book. It's a little bit more of a what do you do? It's not how do you do it, it's what do you do? And then if you want to learn how do you do it, you got to read another book that's a little bit more in depth. So this book might say something like, you could use a cliffhanger, but it might not talk exactly about how do you do an effective cliffhanger, right? That's kind of the difference there. So yeah, Significant Zero is another book. I actually really enjoyed that book. That one's quite entertaining. This book's funny. The author's really funny and charismatic. You could just tell it really, the words come out of the page, and there's a number of moments in this book where I did smile or even laugh, because I think the writer's just that good. They do a really good job of keeping it entertaining, even if it's some dry parts. There might be an area where, for example, that particular passage that I read to you that stuck out to me was in the easily the worst section of the book, which is all these boring definitions after definition. And she'll just kind of slip in those little insights there, which I really enjoyed, and I think that's wonderful. There was another vignette that stood out to me. It was a story she told about how she had visited a live theater performance, and it's a little vague. It seems heavily implied that she was quite dismissive of interactive theater prior to engaging with this. So I don't know if like it was a little bit weird passage, I guess, because it was implied that like she kind of thought theater was like lame, I guess, or just pedestrian. But after she saw this performance that significantly impacted her, something about a pig and a naked man in real life, that was, it was compelling to her. And then since then, she's had a deeper appreciation for the art form. And, maybe it sounds a little trite, but it's like, I think a lot of us have experienced something like that. A lot of the writing that I've done in games, it's not something I actually considered when I was starting off this video, but most of the writing I've done has been for LARPs. I've done a lot of LARP writing through university and stuff like that, at live action roleplay, and I love that medium. I think it's a lot of fun, but it's actually not even something I traditionally consider when it comes to video game writing. And I think that she did a somewhat good job of sort of talking about how theater and Ibsen and some of these influential people in the writing sphere have sort of influenced the medium to sort of where it is now, and how it's even developing further. I think that's all really cool. Are you going to find a list of sort of influential writers of our time in here? Schaefer, Levine, etc. No, you're not. They're not. There's not a lot of it's not a lot of that going on, and that's why when I say it seems a little bit like academic, it's like, you could tell this person got a very formal writing degree, because it certainly doesn't. Yeah, there's a lot of holes, I would say. It reminds me of something a math teacher told me once upon a time, when he said, there are some tough problems in math right now, but I hesitate to explain them to you the way that I've had them explained to me with all of my experience, because I feel like if I taught you everything I know, and then I brought you to a problem that I'm not able to currently solve, then you would be just as able to solve it as I am, right? Because now we're in the same exact boat. I'm just bringing you to where I am. And there's something to be said. This math teacher was explaining how, like, if you learn in a very different environment, you might come at this problem with a totally different approach that's informed by your past experiences, the kind of work you've done, and just how you see the world. And that might give you the right insight to crack the code and to figure out how to solve this problem. So I think about that a lot. And I think about how it relates to really learning any discipline. Because this is one person's perspective, right? Which is admittedly very different than mine. I didn't have the same, I guess, training that this person did in some areas. And so it was really eye-opening to sort of gain a different perspective. And I think that's the value of reading a lot of different books, Of course, at the end of the day, when someone asks you what book to recommend, you can only, recommend them maybe a few. But this writer does a really good job of linking a number of different books that they recommend, and for different reasons. It was a little bit weird, frankly, but there's a section of this book that kind of just reads like a blog post of like, here are some books I recommend for you. And it's like I recommend this book and this thing, It kind of read like a review you might read in the Times or something, of just like a bunch of different books. I don't know where it is, somewhere in here. And I actually wrote down a number of those books, and I was like, oh, okay, this resonates with me. I think I might check that out. And so I really enjoyed that as well. So let's conclude. I think this book is a good book for you if you don't have a lot of experience in video game writing, if you're a beginner. I think if you are an experienced writer who is coming into this industry for the first time, then there are better books. And I think still, no matter who you are, I would say this book is not my number one recommendation for video game writing. I would still go with the Thug book, The Ultimate Guide to Video Game Writing and Design. But I think this book is really good as a resource in terms of introducing you to some sort of like basic stuff. If you're totally new to this, you don't know what a cliffhanger is, things like that. It's like, okay, this is a good place to start. You don't know what a 3-act structure is and things like that. I think this is a great place to go there. It might be useful for someone like me who didn't have an understanding of like how Ibsen's work. Like, I had read A Doll's House. I think we read it in like grade school, but I didn't know how that had shaped storytelling, like as a practice. And so I thought that was really cool. But again, this book doesn't go very deep into the craft. So it's a book about the what, but not a book about how do you actually do it. So that's my review for this book. And let me know in the comments section if you read this book, or if you, I'd really love to know if you have a recommendation for a different book in this kind of genre, in this kind of category, which you think is particularly insightful, that stuck with you because you feel like it delivered a lot of value. As somebody who, I would personally love to know about books that are really good, even if you're already an expert. Like, even if you're already an expert, but you can go to this book and you can open it up and you can gain some insights, that would be the kind of thing I'd be really interested to hear more about. So without further ado, that's it for this video, and thanks for watching.